This is Duke University. I have the great honor to introduce our closing keynote speaker, Jonathan Greenblatt. Jonathan is a serial social entrepreneur and an acknowledged thought leader on ethical branding, global development, and social entrepreneurship. And I could go on and on about his accolades, but I'm going to keep this short. So among his many, many accomplishments, Jonathan is the founder and president of Our Good Works, a nonprofit organization that manages All for Good, which is an open source web-based platform designed to enable more people to serve. He also formerly worked as the CEO of Good Worldwide, an integrated media company whose products include the award-winning print magazine Good, and as well as the online destination Good Is. In 2003, Jonathan co-founded Ethos Brands and launched Ethos Water, a bottled water that helps children around the world get access to clean water. By linking water consumption to such a cause, Ethos has allowed consumers to engage in a collective effort to help developing communities around the world. Currently, Jonathan teaches social entrepreneurship at the Anderson Graduate School of Management at UCLA, and also continues to advise corporations, foundations, and non-governmental organizations on the intersection of business and sustainability. Ethos itself has grown from a very small startup to one that is projected to donate at least $10 million through 2010 to support humanitarian causes in the water sector. And in 2005, Ethos was purchased by Starbucks. Jonathan's work exemplifies exactly why we are here today: to educate and inspire students and professionals on rapidly evolving opportunities to create positive and sustainable change. The mission of our club is to instill in students the desire to make a meaningful impact in the world, regardless of which sector they choose to pursue. And Jonathan's work at Ethos Water and All for Good is really in line with this mission of our club, and as well as illustrate some of the innovative ways that business professionals with a social conscience can really make a difference in both the private and social sectors. Jonathan has helped to show how companies can increase their bottom line while at the same time creating a more sustainable world. And last, but certainly not least, Jonathan is the type of leader we all hope to become, and we're thrilled to have him here today. So please join me in welcoming Jonathan Greenblatt.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you for that very nice introduction. All right, let's see if I'm on. I guess I am on here, huh? Great. So hopefully my laptop will pop over. Do I need to hit something? Let's see. The perils of the live demo. So let's try function F8 one more time. That looked promising. Sort of. There we go. Great. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Michelle, for that very nice introduction. And I want to thank Vince and Remia and all the students involved in organizing this conference for what's been a really, really wonderful experience for me thus far. I really appreciate your Southern hospitality. And it's really nice for me to be here at Duke because I think you've got some really amazing people here on this campus, in this school, who are really pushing the boundaries of sort of scholarship and thought leadership in the field of sustainability. And so I will take the liberty and use this sort of opportunity to both highlight Professor Dees, who is one of the sort of preeminent thinkers in the field of social entrepreneurship. And as I think Dina mentioned, or someone mentioned earlier today, has really sort of blazed a trail for people like me in many respects. And I'll also point out Dan Vermeer, who's running the Corporate Sustainability Initiative, who is also someone who exemplifies doing this work in practice at a pretty large organization like the Coca-Cola Company, and then bringing those insights and learning into an academic institution. So you've got two really interesting thinkers and thought leaders in your midst, and so for me, it's wonderful to have the chance to be here. So this is what I'm going to sort of talk about today, and what I tried to do is sort of put together some remarks that would serve as, if you will, a capstone for this conference. Because I think The topics that you've looked at, and I had a chance to look at the program in advance, are pretty interesting and cover a wide range. And so what I thought I could try to do is deliver a message to all of you. Because to be very honest, it wasn't very long ago where I was sitting in your shoes. I got an MBA at Kellogg in '99, which, you know, it's frankly not that long ago. So I really understand what you're going through as you think about your next steps, sort of as MBAs, and how you're going to enter the professional world, and how you apply some of these values and these insights. So hopefully my remarks will help you in some small way think about where you're headed. So what I'm going to do is sort of organize my talk a little bit about my background, the context in which I think we're operating, and then I want to talk about what I see as an opportunity for renewal. I have a lot of reasons to be hopeful, and hopefully all of you will walk away from this talk feeling really upbeat about the future. And then I'm going to talk about some case studies to drill down a little bit and to go deeper on why I feel so positive. So first of all, origins. I think, you know, I got my start being sort of an activist at a very young age. When I was probably 6 or 7 years old, my parents had me in Bridgeport, Connecticut, marching with them, holding placards to free the Soviet Jews. Now, many of you might be young enough that you don't even remember this. But there was certainly a time when there was a Soviet Union, and Soviet Jews weren't allowed to worship and couldn't get jobs and couldn't emigrate. And so there was a movement afoot in this country and around the world to let those Soviet Jews emigrate from the Soviet Union. And there were marches, and there were rallies, and there were boycotts, and there were protests, and there was lobbying, and there was letter writing, and there were petitions. And there was a whole organized movement of which I played as insignificant a role as you could imagine a 6-year-old would play. But I learned something, because guess what? It worked. It worked. All of those efforts and all of those entreaties and all of that energy helped to foment a movement that resulted in pressure on that government, and they let the Jews leave. Now, things changed after the Iron Curtain fell, but I think what was important is I learned at a very young age that if you believe and you apply yourself, you can make change, period. And so I think I was lucky to start from that sort of point of view, and that actually helped to motivate me when I graduated from college in 1992. I was the first in my family to go to college, and I decided, much to my parents' chagrin, that I was going to work after I graduated as a waiter in Harvard Square so that I could go volunteer for Governor Bill Clinton's first presidential campaign, which my parents thought was a terrible idea. Because if you remember back in that time, it was sort of Obama-esque. He was a dark horse. Most people were not familiar with him before he ran, and there were lots of reasons why he couldn't win. One was named Bush, the other was named Perot, and there was all kinds of other factors going on. So my parents thought, wow, the idea that you were going to volunteer, anyone here from Arkansas? I need to ask that question. Okay, from a governor from a redneck state where none of our family has ever visited, and who was going to lose, by the way, and maybe not even win the nomination, seemed to them just like one of the worst ideas I could possibly have. But I had learned already that if you sort of will it, you know, it can happen. And so I believed, and so I made the decision to go move to Little Rock, Arkansas, and to go work for this guy, and everything worked out okay in the end. So I think I start this talk, I hope, on a note of optimism that I hope all of you sort of share. I think just because you're dealing with, you know, as an MBA with these big decisions about where you enter in the summer, where you go to work, you know, when you graduate, don't lose sight of the fact that you can drive a massive social impact, each person one at a time, if you believe. And you've got to start with that, which I think is a real deep-seated, passionate belief. So let's talk a little bit about the context in which we're operating today, because I think there are several trends afoot. I think Chad may have talked to some of these issues this morning, but I'm going to touch on them because I think they're relevant. The first one of which, and they paint a picture, the world in which we're operating today is very different than it was, again, just 10 years ago when I graduated. I think the first thing we're dealing with is an environment of enormous fragility. Despite the climate skeptics, I think few people would disagree with the data, and the preponderance of data is indisputable. The fact that carbon levels are at their highest in 650,000 years, the fact that the temperature keeps rising, the fact that climate change is no longer a question of whether or not it can be averted. It becomes a question of whether or not we can adapt to it effectively, and how are we going to do that. And so I think we are living at a point of fragility which is a bit ahistoric. I think we are also living in a moment that I think is best described as one of adjacency. This is the result of globalization, where tariff and non-tariff barriers have fallen, where airlines and telecommunications means we are as likely to be next door and close to somebody in Qatar as we are in Chapel Hill. We may be playing bridge with them online or Facebooking with them or whatnot. But we live in a world today without borders, and that death of distance is remarkable, and it's real, and it's new. I think we also live in a time of enormous computing power, which is best exemplified by mobility. How many of you in this room have BlackBerries or iPhones or Android devices? Raise your hand. Okay, who doesn't, right? There you go, a couple of you. Wow, the laggards. No, but it's interesting. I mean, there's more computing power, in my BlackBerry than there was in the control room in Houston that put a man on the moon. The Mobile World Congress is taking place this week in Barcelona. There's 6.8, roughly 6.5 billion people on the planet. They estimate by the end of 2010 there will be 5 billion subscriptions to mobile phones in this world. Can you imagine that? Already there are 4.6 or 4.7 billion people subscribe to mobile phone services. It's amazing. And within 5 years, more people will access the internet from phones than from conventional computers or laptops. I mean, it's profound how there's been this trend of affordability, and now you get this massive, again, this powerful devices in your hand, which change the way we interact with information. Which also, I think, is part of a second trend, which is, well, how many of you recognize this? Well, let me ask a question differently. How many of you are tweeting right now as I speak? You gotta be careful. Or how many of you use Twitter or Facebook? Fair number, right? So I think oftentimes it feels like noise, the constant deluge of information, real time in 140 characters. That's just, we're swimming in it. But sometimes it actually makes a difference. Sometimes it actually begets change, or at least changes the way we think, and has an impact on real-time political environments like what happened in Iran this summer. So I think there is a moment now of immediacy where anything is discoverable at any given time thanks to Google, and anything can be known in real time thanks to services like Facebook or Twitter. And so again, I think that changes the nature of conversation when we have supercomputers in our palms that can connect us with anyone, anywhere, in real time. And I think one of the trends that is kind of troubling is it creates great awareness about the inequities that are out there. Now, it's not to say that we aren't at a wonderful point in the history of human development where living standards have been raised and many diseases have been, we have found cures for many diseases, and living standards, again, are better in many ways than they have been in the course of humanity. On the other hand, when anything can be known anywhere in real time, some of the inequities become more obvious than ever before. And that can become very troubling. So right now, we live in a moment where over half the population of the planet now lives in cities. It's never happened before. And a third of those people live in slums. Right? There are about roughly 4 billion people who live on less than $4 a day. And the concentration of wealth has also reached a level where it's never been before. So it's not that there weren't these issues previously, but now when everything is known to anyone, anywhere, these kinds of issues can be troubling. And you can see the examples of inequity, just like what happened in Haiti last month. There was an earthquake of a similar magnitude in this country, right, in the Bay Area in 1989. Anybody know the casualty number, the number of people who died in that earthquake? 57. And they still haven't recovered all the bodies, but they estimate upwards of 200,000 people died in Haiti last month. So again, I think you see the inequities and you see what happens in these sort of, in much weaker, less developed societies today in a way you just didn't know about before. And I think that actually also fuels a sense of uncertainty, where all of us, are living in a moment where we are concerned about the fact that our institutions are failing. And we're gripped in a financial crisis, the likes of which we haven't seen in many, many generations. That's very troubling. The unemployment levels, if you look at partially employed people as well as unemployment, it's so high. And it appears if we're headed for sort of a Japanese-style period of sort of flatline growth for some time. This is very scary stuff. You can see it in the announcement the president made just a couple weeks ago. And so there's great uncertainty about how are we going to move forward. And I think what compounds a sense of uncertainty is I think there's a thread that we can see running through some of the people who we normally might look to for leadership, right? So normally we might look to our elected leaders, or we might look to candidates, sort of would-be leaders, right, who seem to fail us as well. Or we might look to our regulators, who seem to be more maybe part of the problem than part of the solution. Or we might look to captains of industry, right, who are supposed to obey sort of some sense of frugality as they're getting bailouts, but fly into Washington on their private jets, right? Or we look at, again, leaders who, at a time when their companies are failing, are handing out billions of dollars worth of bonuses to their people, or redoing their offices, at the cost of millions, while millions of people are suffering from the bad decisions that they made. So I think this breeds widespread cynicism. I'm sure that all of you feel some of this way, as the people we might normally look to for leadership seem to be failing us, seem to be falling short, seem to not have the answers. So there are lots of reasons for concern, and a number of these trends seem almost intractable. And yet I can tell you that I think that one of the things that this seems to fuel is a search for something different. I really think that the former governor from Alaska really did a disservice with her comments last week. She said to the Tea Party convention, whatever your political leanings, by the way, she said to the Tea Party convention, how is that hopey, changey thing working out for you? I think in actuality, I think it is amazing how Americans continue to have a remarkable sense of hope. And it fuels the desire for people like this, and it fuels the desire for other candidates. Because I think Americans almost suffer from an inexhaustible supply of optimism. And we look outside for leaders who sort of have an authenticity to them and a sincerity to them, who bring new ideas. And that optimism doesn't go away. In part, it's why I personally feel like, as bad as it looks as we sort of pave over our resources, why I feel a sense right now at this time of great renewal. And I feel really, really hopeful. And it's exemplified by all of you. Like, what fuels that hope for me? It's what we're going to talk about today, which is really social entrepreneurship. And so I see it emerging all around us. I see it in innovative nonprofits, and I see it in innovative for-profits. I see it in organizations here in the US, and I see it in organizations abroad. I see the emergence of what I describe as the economy of integrity. And I think you see it across sectors. I think you see it in every category, just below the surface, beginning to sprout up. And it's an economy that's being built by amazing people, by our modern day sort of pioneers and trailblazers. And these are, in a way, if you will, the new heroes, as the Skoll Foundation called them a few years ago, or new leaders who aren't caught up in convention and are really, in their own way, each of them pioneering new paths forward. And I describe these people as socialpreneurs. And it was sort of alluded to, I think, by Professor Dees in his conversation with Dina Powell from the Goldman Sachs Foundation earlier today. He said she's sort of an intrapreneuring. I think preneuring, if you will, and you'll allow me that term, I should copyright it. It's not about being just an entrepreneur. You can also be an intrapreneur. And I'll talk about what I think are the characteristics of these people. But I think many of them are likely sitting across from me right now all over this room. And I think as these people are building this, I think the thing that may be most relevant here in sort of this environment is these socialpreneurs are creating this economy of integrity with ethical brands, with businesses, whole cloth, or with products or services inside those businesses, which demonstrate a series of characteristics or traits, and I'll talk about what those are. The next generation of ethical brands will be built by you. You. Whether you're leaving here to go your own startup or you're leaving here to go to Procter & Gamble, I think you have the opportunity to help contribute to this economy of integrity. I'll talk about how. So briefly, so who are these sort of, as I describe them, these socialpreneurs? Well, if you'll allow me, I want to build on some definitional work that Professor Dees has done and others have done to give you what I think they represent. And you can ask yourself, is this you? So I think, first of all, these people are change agents. These people have demonstrated, probably throughout their lives, that they're type A personalities who are about changing things, and they are never satisfied. And that shows up in different ways at different stages of their life. But they are change agents. Secondly, they are characterized by this sort of gene, this compassion gene, that's almost encoded in their DNA. And it may be something that they demonstrate throughout their life, or it may be something that's triggered by some epiphany, some personal experience, some moment of awakening, when something is triggered in their brain stem, and it reorients the way they think. They pursue a path of direct action. They are about building and creating. It is that act of creation which is almost their sort of defining trait and behavior. So it's not about lobbying, if you will, or some broad advocacy. It's about building something, rolling up your sleeves and actually doing it. At the same time, as someone who comes from a family of self-employed people, my grandfather, my father, never worked for big companies, always did it on their own. I think the thing about the entrepreneur is they try to create, the socialpreneur is he tries to create a new equilibrium. What do I mean by that? I mean, he is not or she is not satisfied by putting up a shingle and creating a store, if you will. They want to change the whole game. They want to turn over an order that they think is flawed or failing for some reason. So they have big ambitions. And likely, if they're in the for-profit realm, they are driving an agenda of social change. Make no mistake, they're pushing a bottom line, right, and trying to drive margin. But they're also doing so with a broader ambition, which is how do I create social gain? Which is the kind of stuff that Milton Friedman could never understand. And yet there are many examples of social entrepreneurs who push this, or entrepreneurs who push this. And if they're in the nonprofit realm, you see them, you see them living by market-based disciplines that you typically would not associate with the nonprofit world. Maybe it's an earned income agenda. Maybe it's a talent management strategy. Maybe it's there are other ways that it can be done. But you see these nonprofit leaders behaving like some of the best people you would expect to find in the for-profit realm. I would describe these as the characteristics of effective socialpreneurs. And you can ask yourselves, is this you? Or will this be you as you leave here? And so then, to talk a bit about the ethical brand. This is what those people build, particularly in the for-profit context. This is what they create and cultivate and groom and scale. And I think the ethical brand has a series of characteristics. It's animated by mission. It emphasizes performance. It exhibits commitment. It is infused with authenticity. It exhibits transparency. And it prioritizes engagement. Sort of not just, it's not a monologue, it's a dialogue. It's a conversation that's co-created with stakeholders. I'll talk about what I mean by that. In fact, let's move to actually talk about case studies. And I'm just going to base this on my experience. Although I think if one were to look broader, you could find lots of examples of ethical brands. So let me start by talking about Ethos, because it certainly is a business that I know pretty well. Having co-founded it with my business partner, we took his business plan and operationalized it and launched it as a business. Actually launched that business out of my house in Los Angeles way back when. But to understand Ethos, you've got to step back and understand the environment in which we were operating, in which we were thinking about how to use a consumer packaged good to drive an impact on arguably the largest issue facing the planet today, which is the world water crisis. There are roughly 1.2 billion people who lack clean drinking water. How many of you have spent time in the developing world? Let's call it the non-OECD world. Raise your hands. So a lot of you, way too many for me to go around the table. But this probably isn't news to you. There's probably stuff you already know about, though most of the US population is still just learning and just being exposed to this. And things like the tsunami or Haiti certainly raise awareness about the fact that 1 in 5 people in the world lack clean drinking water. And roughly 2.6 billion lack basic sanitation. What I mean by that, no place to brush your teeth, no place to wash your hands, no latrine to use. Frankly, probably it's reasonable to believe that a large portion of those people don't even really have a deep appreciation for germ theory and understand the priority of washing your hands and good hygiene, even though it's that sort of oral fecal loop that contributes to disease. To many, this is just a marginal activity that is discretionary, sort of at best. And that contributes to the massive number of deaths. You know, a child dies every 14 seconds from water-related disease. Every 14 seconds. There are roughly 5 million people who die every year from the problem. I mean, it's the largest killer of kids around the world under the age of 5. And what do you think is actually the condition that kills these kids? What would you guess? Yeah. Diarrhea and the dehydration that results from it. I mean, diarrhea. I have 3 children at home, 6, 5, and less than a year. And I think in this day and age, again, we have such technology at our disposal. I think it is intolerable that we should allow children on this planet to die from something as solvable as diarrhea. It's unacceptable. It's unacceptable. Not only is the mortality, beyond comprehension, but the morbidity or the broader human impacts are also worth talking about. In parts of sub-Saharan Africa, women walk on average 6 miles a day to retrieve water for their families. Think about that. Now, we're not talking about leisurely strolls, in your Crocs or your Tom shoes, to go get water from a nice, clean water tap. These women often wake up at the crack of dawn, oftentimes bearing their children, and they journey through paths, because we're not talking about paved roads. And when they get to that water source, if there's water there, and it isn't always, they're probably sharing that pool of water with animals or other people who may be bathing themselves or defecating or doing all kinds of things in that water. And they get that water and they'll put it in a bucket or in a gourd, or sometimes like a recycled chemical container, and it can weigh 20 to 30 to 40 pounds. Then they walk home. I mean, this is a brutal cycle that repeats itself every day. And you can imagine the wasted productivity and the squandered time that results from it. I mean, it's not good. So what's so interesting is when you think about this, you start to wonder, well, what would be the cost to give someone a lifetime supply of clean water? If we wanted to actually solve this problem, what would it take? This is probably the wrong audience in which to do what I'm about to try. But sort of any guesses? What would you think? I cold call on my students at UCLA. I don't want to do that here. Somebody volunteer. What do you think is the cost? $1,000? Guess? 5,000? Per person. So WaterAid, which is about the best NGO in the world focused on these issues, has done lots of analyses around this. And based on a 15-country average, which incorporates sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, they estimate the cost at about $25 a day. $25 a day to give someone a lifetime supply of clean water and sanitation. I mean, just think about the money you have right now in your wallets, right, and the impact that you could have. So when you start to understand that the costs to solve this problem are so low and the scope of the problem is so large, you really start thinking. And then I think what even fuels that fire more is when you start to think about this, right? So last year, the estimates of the size of the bottled water industry, the US bottled water industry, roughly $15 billion. $15 billion for a product that, let's say, so here's something. How many of you drank bottled water this week? Raise your hand. Kind of sheepish, sort of me. How many of you drank bottled water a dozen years ago? How many of you drank it 20 years ago? 2 of you. I mean, this industry didn't exist really in this country in a meaningful way 20 years ago. Just sort of Evian or Perrier or a couple local springs. And we have learned over time that we almost have to drink it. We've been marketed to by all the big major multinational corporations. And so now it exists, and it is enormous. And one of the interesting things about it is economically it's crazy, and environmentally it's just plain nuts. The idea that you have to bring your water in from the French Alps is in and of itself, almost inexcusable. But then, the vast majority of the bottled water containers in the United States are not recycled. By the way, it's not just bottled water containers. It's also soda pop, and it's also juice. And it's other sort of ready-to-drink beverages. But only upwards of 12 to 15% are ever recycled. So you've got a huge environmental disaster compounded by a huge economic sort of absurdity. And when you map that to the problem, suddenly you start thinking, is there a way we could turn this around? And that essentially is the genesis of Ethos, which is, could we convert this product of extravagance and transform it into a product of compassion? Would there be a way to convert the act of drinking bottled water here to helping someone in need get water around the world? Could we link water for water? And that's basically where Ethos got started. And I think, in my mind, really sort of exemplifies this notion of mission. Ethos Water didn't start to be the biggest bottled water company. It didn't start off to sell the most product. It started off with the idea of, could we link water for water? And we thought about bottled water as the best way initially to do that. And so we aspired to donate 50% of our profits to fund water-related programs around the world. And so that's really where it began. It starts with mission. Ethical brands, Jeffrey Hollander, the former CEO of Seventh Generation, and a very thoughtful fellow, and a great blogger, by the way, who's written a lot about sort of socially responsible business. He wrote a great book called What Matters Most. And he talks about intention matters most. And ethical brands start with intention. Now, to sort of drill a little bit deeper on Ethos, I want to sort of step back for a moment. How many of you recognize this? This is, what is it? Maslow's hierarchy, right? Abraham Maslow, famous sociologist. This is hierarchy of human needs. Now I'm going to take a leap, and I'm going to map the bottled water industry to this, if you'll sort of indulge me for a moment. And I'll explain why at the end. So we start off with basic body needs. And I would say that what I would compare to that is the bottled water space, private label waters. Kirkland that you might buy at Costco, or something you might buy from the convenience store. Typically people just reach and grab for it because it's there, and it's cheap, and it's convenient. And so it just basically hydrates you. That's all it does. Just serves a very immediate need. And then you get brands that evoke a sense of trust. So like in the Mid-Atlantic or the Northeast, Poland Spring from an idyllic spot in Maine. Or Deer Park from some fanciful place. Look, you've got the reindeer and the mountain. How many of you actually believe there is a place called Deer Park where this water comes from? Please, just don't raise your hands. But Nestle Waters, the largest bottled water company on the planet, years ago rolled up lots of local springs and created regional brands. And you can only get Deer Park here in this part of the country. Like you can only get Poland Spring in the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast, like you can only get Arrowhead where I live. And what they're doing is, with their labeling and with the sort of association, is creating some sense of trust. You feel secure. It's from a place you know, Poland Spring. When really that isn't the reality at all. And then you have the brands like Aquafina and Dasani, which are owned by Pepsi and Coca-Cola, respectively. As if, and these are municipal waters, right? These are regional, as much regional as it gets, because they're from 30 to 40 some odd bottling plants across the United States. It's just tap water. It's just tap water. That's all it is. Now it's sort of hyper-filtered and it's very clean, and stuff is added to this, salt is basically added to Dasani to make it taste a little better. Minerals, I think is what they call it. But in reality, these are billion-dollar brands, and of course it's called Aquafina, as if, again, that were some place in Italy or something, or Dasani. But in reality, these are just municipal waters. But they leverage the massive distribution power of Coke and Pepsi, right? So they can be found, I think Bob Gozzietta, the former CEO of Coca-Cola, he had this, he called it the 100 strategy, right? He wanted you to be able to get a can of Coke within 100 feet of you at any given time, at any point in the United States of America. You know, through vending machines and distribution relationships, he actually almost achieved that vision. Well, now these brands leverage that massive platform, and you can find them everywhere. And so they're very socially acceptable. They put massive marketing dollars behind them as well. And these were the first very big national brands that, again, were easily found and socially acceptable. And then you had brands like Evian and Fiji, like a affordable luxury. Like, oh, I can't afford to go to the Pacific Islands, but I can drink Fiji and feel special. Or Evian. And again, I think the labeling and the package, the whole kit and caboodle contributes to this sense of exoticism, as if water from the Pacific Islands were better for you somehow, right? Or were worth more, you know, than water from North Carolina. At the top of that frame, we thought that's where Ethos will live. Because instead of it being water that does something for you, this would be water that does something for others. Instead of it being water for me, it's water for the world. That's really how we thought about it. But the interesting thing that we learned that is critical for you as MBAs and as futurepreneurs is, here's the thing, you only get to sort of play up here on that top of the apex of the pyramid if you deliver the basic hydration needs, if you are from a source that people can trust, if you are well distributed and well marketed, if you have a package and aestheticism that evokes an appeal with consumers. You know, nobody cuts you any breaks. You don't get any slack. If you want to make it, socialpreneurship is not for the faint of heart, right? You better be as good, if not better, than the competition on all of the key dimensions in your particular environment. I don't care whether you're building a services business or you're launching a packaged goods brand. So the cause is almost like a tiebreaker. And this is what I really mean by performance. You know, whether it's a bottle of Honest Tea, or it's a pair of Tom shoes, or it's a zip car, or whatever the product that you're trying, it will only work. You may initially get trial because someone will give you a chance. But you better believe they're only going to keep you on the shelf in the store if you get the right sales velocity. And you, as fickle and discerning consumers, are only going to buy it twice or 3 times and go from, you know, if you will, through that funnel, from trial to repetition to loyalty, if the product or service delivers on all dimensions. So this is really important. Let's talk for a minute about authenticity. So I'm going to switch gears now and talk about all for good. So I served on the Obama transition team in Washington in late 2008 and early 2009. And one of the claims, if you will, or one of the stated goals of President Obama was how, or candidate Obama, was how we could get more Americans to serve. Now, who wouldn't be opposed to that, right? Like everybody would. How many of you volunteer in your spare time? Raise your hands. Okay, pretty much everybody here. But as a candidate, what Senator Obama talked about was we need to also think differently about volunteerism and more expansively about what it means to be engaged. Because the goal of volunteerism or service isn't service in and of itself. It's really about strengthening community. So some people might strengthen community by cleaning the beach, or by painting a school, or by teaching for America. But there are lots of ways that we can create community. So for example, another way to create community might be, let's say you're a parent with a child on the autistic spectrum. Maybe you don't have the time to clean the beach, or you don't have time to sort of teach for America, because you've got to make a living and take care of your children. But maybe there are other parents like you, other moms, let's say, with children on that autistic spectrum, and you want to get them engaged, and you want to trade tips, and you want to swap stories, and you want to learn how to be a more effective parent for a child with this disorder. So you organize a meetup. And 10 or 12 or 18, 15, let's say, parents get together every week at that local Panera or that Starbucks to commune and to convene and to create community amongst themselves. Or maybe you don't have time to do even that, but you've got a wallet and you want to make a difference in education, so you decide to use a service like Donors Choose to adopt a classroom. Or maybe you don't have that, but what you do is you have time standing in line at the DMV. And you can pop open your iPhone and you can tag photos for the Smithsonian. President Obama had a vision, or candidate Obama had a vision of using service to strengthen community and making that more accessible and inclusive. So everyone, regardless of your economic status, regardless of your time and engage in their communities. So we took that vision out to Silicon Valley, and we engaged some of the best people in technology. And we took that vision out to the nonprofit sector, engaged some of the leading people in that world. And through that coalition, we created All for Good. All for Good happened. And it's now the leading, it's the largest aggregation of volunteer listings on the internet today. 225, 250,000 listings. It's really grown dramatically since it launched just 7 months ago, and it's growing every day because it comes from an authentic place of meaning. And it starts off with the desire not to make the most money, but think about how we can engage the most Americans in service. And by taking a new look at that, I think it's that authenticity and sincerity of our message that's allowed this service to grow as large as it has. Today it's providing listings to the White House, to the Huffington Post, to MTV, to ARP, to lots of other publishers and developers. It's really worked quite well. So I think it's an example of what I would describe, another example of what I would describe as authenticity. Now, I got to tell you something. Authenticity can go different ways. If you're going to make a claim to be authentic, and you're going to sort of make a claim to be doing something better for the world, you had better live up to that ethos. Because if you don't, you will be slaughtered by the critics. And I think the Red campaign is a really good example of that. I'm a big fan of the Red campaign. The Red campaign has donated tens of millions of dollars to the Global Fund. And along the way, they've educated people. But make no mistake, they have their critics. This is the Buy Less Crap campaign, which was started by an online activist and graphic designer up in the Bay Area. I've seen this myself. Ethos has been gotten its share of criticism for people who think that it's inauthentic, that it's not a good way to help people around the world get clean water. And I hear that criticism. But part of the authenticity thing is it can work both ways. And as I think Dina said earlier today in her talk with Professor Dees, I think consumers sniff out what's not authentic. When CSR is just corporate spin and rhetoric, consumers will let you have it. They won't buy it. Next point is commitment. I'm going to talk about Good Magazine, which is the business that I ran before joining the transition. How many of you have read Good Magazine? Raise your hands. A couple of you. I was pleased to see it over in your offices, Matt, which is just really great. So go to Matt's office if you want to see a copy of the magazine. But it was a magazine that was basically we thought about it as a lifestyle brand, about entertaining things that matter. And we took sort of a very utilitarian view of that. But we put our money where our mouth is. How do we do that? Well, when you subscribe to Good Magazine, you could choose to donate your subscription to a nonprofit of your choice. You could choose from amongst this sort of curated set of nonprofits who we had reviewed and made sure we thought they were legit, doing innovative things. It was a way for us to highlight groups that many people knew about, like let's say, NRDC or TEACH, and also for us to elevate new organizations, and newer like Room to Read, or the Iraq-Afghan Vets Association, or 826. This program generated over $1 million within its first 2 years. That's an example of what I would describe as commitment. You've got to find ways to infuse your ethos throughout your value chain. You can't just talk the talk. You really got to walk the walk. This became a great way as well to gain promotional exposure for the brand. Make no mistake. It helped. It worked. But by foregoing all that revenue, that's a problem. By foregoing all that revenue, we sort of made it up on the back end with, I would say, more subscribers who subscribed because they saw we were deeply committed to our mission of making the world a better place. Second example of this, I would say, is Ethos. Now again, bottled water is bad on so many levels. What we tried to do was to mitigate our footprint however we could. So we sourced our water, for example, from the Sierra Nevada mountains, which meant for us that, pretty impressive, if I can get this to work on the fly, that meant for us that we didn't grow outside our region if we didn't have a spring there. So we had opportunities to go to the East Coast. We said, no, we won't go until we can find a spring on the East Coast. So we can sort of minimize our water miles, if you will. Make sure we're doing this as environmentally sensibly as we could. We looked at biodegradable packaging options to take out as much plastic and cardboard from our case as we could. We did what we thought we were able to do, try to minimize our footprint and maximize our commitment to the cause wherever possible. I think another point about the ethical brands is transparency. And All for Good really exemplifies this. It's what you call an open source effort. Now, how many of you are familiar with open source? Oh, many of you. So can you describe it for me, to everyone?
So, to my knowledge, open source is when you publish the for the web release, you publish the ability to participate to everyone and encourage as many people as possible to help you build something, participate.
I think that's pretty good. Anyone want to build on that?
I think it specifically relates to your software itself. The IPs, the kind of software and the code that's usually protected by like a Microsoft to send to all software.
Yeah, I think these things are pretty good. Open source is an ethos that you typically started in software. It's grown, I think, beyond software. And it's about, number one, making the IP available so anyone can see it. So for example, with All for Good as an open source venture, we publish our source code. The kind of stuff that places like Microsoft or other typically software companies kept inside for a very long time. We're now making it open, which also is about getting more people involved. It creates actually a more scalable labor model. I think transparency, though, is more than open source. It's a way of doing business. It's making yourself, for better or worse, warts and all, available to the public. So for example, we basically publish our roadmap. Oops, I won't try to go back again because that would too much trouble. But we publish our roadmap. We actually publish our bug list on the web. So anyone can go up and see if All for Good isn't working, click on a link, see our bug list, and actually add a bug for something you think is not working well. And you can check the status of how we're resolving those things. Transparency is a way of doing business that previously, I think, was not very popular. It's increasingly the norm in an interconnected world. And it puts an onus on you to live up to your values by willing to put everything out there in the public domain. Last point is one of engagement. I think engagement today has really been accelerated by the growth of social networking. Many of you probably use Facebook and Twitter, these things that I mentioned before. Engagement has got to be genuine and real. Did any of you participate in the Chase Community Giving campaign? It took place sort of late last year? Yeah? So it was very popular. Many people did participate in it, and yet it got an enormous amount of criticism. They posted a campaign for you could choose the nonprofits to which they would donate $5 million. And then some of those profits, like for example, a nonprofit that was focused on, I guess you'd call it a pro-life nonprofit. Another one about legalizing marijuana. They suddenly disappeared. And they got too many votes. And they were called out on it. Chase was called out on it by online activists and by journalists and by others. Engagement has got to be real. As a counterpoint to this, Pepsi recently launched something called the Pepsi Refresh campaign. To their credit, they've learned from the Chase example. So they're doing an online campaign as well, engaging consumers, and yet this time they've posted a leaderboard where you can see the finalists, the dates about when the finalists are being announced. You can look at and see who the leaders are for each of these different categories. And they've curated the categories with the help of Good Magazine, sort of my alma mater, if you will, and with leaders for each category who are taking responsibility for them. So engagement has to be real with consumers, but when you do it in a sincere and authentic way, magical things can happen. So I'll give you an example, harkening back to Ethos. So when we first started the company, we didn't have any money. We funded it with our credit cards, couldn't get anybody to fund our ridiculous idea. So it was me and my business partner, Peter, and we had one guy, a delivery guy named Ben, who had two main qualifications. Number one, he was a guitar player in a band, which means he had all his gigs at night, so he had nothing to do during the day. And secondly, he owned a pickup truck with a cab on the back, which meant he could move more water than we could in my banged-up Nissan or a station wagon that Pete borrowed from a family friend. So this was Ben's two main qualifications to be our first employee. It was a great sort of recruitment process. Very Goldman Sachs-esque, if you will. And so I was in our global command center, which was really just my house, one morning, and it was in roughly like, let's say May 2004. And when you have a bottled water product, the regulations say you have to have a phone number in case there's a problem. So you have a phone number right on the back of the bottle. And it was like 1-888-88-ETHOS. And in reality, it just pointed to my home phone, right? We couldn't afford another line or anything like that. And so I had a double, Verizon, California, lets you have a double ring on your phone. So you can differentiate between incoming numbers. So if the phone rang, ring, say hello. But if our house, the phone rang, ring, 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 me or my wife or Peter or anybody else would say, Ethos Water, how may I direct your call? So And you've got to do that when you have customers who actually think there's a business behind this thing. So anyways, I'm in the global command center at my son's bedroom. It's a Monday morning. It's about 8:30 in the morning, and the phone rings. And you get all kinds of wacky calls, I should say, as you might imagine, right? Strange calls in the middle of the night from random people. So it's not unusual. Phone, ring, ring. Ethos, what? How may I direct your call? It says, hi, I'd like to speak to somebody in the marketing department. Okay, well, can I get your name and maybe I can help? I'm calling about this person from a Whole Foods. I'm calling about the Ethos barrel. I want the Ethos barrel for my store. Okay, what's your name? I'll have something for the marketing department, get right back to you. And hang up the phone. We don't have any barrels. We couldn't afford to pay ourselves. We could barely afford to pay Ben. I didn't know what he was talking about. Literally, like an hour later, the phone rings again. Ring, ring. Ethos, what? How may I direct your call? This is whatever, Ray. I'm at the Whole Foods in Thousand Oaks, California. Now to explain, we lived in Marina Del Rey, and Thousand Oaks is about an hour and a half away, so it's very far. Yes, how can I help you? I'm calling about the Ethos barrel. We want it for our store. And I say, this is 2 calls, 1 hour, so something's going on, right? Monday morning. So I'm like, well, maybe I can help you. My name's Jonathan. I'm one of the co-founders of the company, and we don't have any barrels. And then this guy, this Whole Foods guy says to me, oh no, I know you do. I've seen it. Okay. So now something going, okay, well, what's your name again, Ray? Okay, and where'd you see it? I saw it at the Whole Foods in Redondo Beach. Okay, Redondo Beach is like an hour south of Marina Del Rey. So there's a big distance between these places. Something is definitely happening here. Like, okay, I'll have someone from marketing get right back to you, marketing. I take down his name and number, I hang up the phone, I call Redondo Beach, I'm like, this is Jonathan. What is going on with these Ethos barrels? Well, at every one of these Whole Foods, they have some poor schlump in the back is the sign maker. The sign maker. So this person is responsible for making all those signs, the pricing signs, the banners. And so this person in the back, along with some other people in the store, were so inspired by our message, they went out and they took an old 7-Up barrel. So there's some poor 7-Up sales guy, still looking for his barrel. My boss is going to kill me. And they took our barrel and they went to our website and they downloaded our graphics in our sort of language and they created this sign. And they created that sign up there and all of this whole display. And then at another Whole Foods, this one by the Grove in Los Angeles, by a big shopping development, they created this end cap for us. Any of you work in the grocery industry or the CPG industry before this? You can imagine somebody up there. Oh, there's Mike. So you're probably the wrong guy to ask, but you can imagine how much this would cost. How much Kraft or P&G or Coca-Cola would pay for something like this. And then at the Whole Foods in Beverly Hills, this is what they did for us. Can you all see that? Can you see what it says up there? So the manager of the store, of the floor, not the whole store, just the floor, the merchandising guy basically, he and his daughter spent a Sunday emptying our 12-bottle cases and wiring this together. And building then in the store that next day these end caps. I've shown this slide to so many people, many in the grocery industry and the beverage industry, and they say, oh my God, how much did you pay for that? It's amazing. How much think we paid for that? Nothing. Nothing. And so what I would say to you is, again, this is a good example, a really good example in my mind, of engagement. This is about creating brands that are accessible and inclusive, not just for your consumers, a la Chase. You know, this is the way to success. Engagement is about all of your stakeholders. It's about the guy making $15 an hour working the floor of a Whole Foods, spending his weekend doing this. So it's about your vendors, and it's about your customers, and it's about your partners, and it's about nonprofits. It's about the broad panoply of potential constituencies. Ethical brands are about engagement at their core. And a last point on that. So one of the things that harkens back to something I said earlier, remember the 6 miles we talked about? So we decided to make World Water Day a day of commemoration for Ethos. How many of you even know there is a World Water Day? Oh, a couple of you. You know what day it is? Anybody? April? Good guess? March 22nd. The UN set it up maybe 15-ish years ago. Actually, to bookend Earth Day. Earth Day is April the 22nd. Water Day is March 22nd. In fact, most people don't know about it. So we decided to change that. So we created a program within Starbucks, a promotion we called Walks for Water. Walks for Water, where people would walk not to raise money, but to raise awareness. Sort of a symbolic gesture with those people who are walking miles a day in places like sub-Saharan Africa. The last time we did this, roughly 10,000 people walked. 10,000 people in 20-some-odd cities across North America. Starbucks customers, Starbucks partners, students and teachers, members of the community, Rotarians, all kinds of people. Why? Because they believed in something bigger. This is engagement. It's thinking differently about your brain and realizing it's a platform for social change. So in closing, I want to sort of stop with the remarks of two individuals. I'm sure many of you, this is a picture, Civil Rights March in sort of the late 50s. I'm sure many of you know this man in the middle of the page. That's Martin Luther King, who made the famous quote, "Life's most urgent question is what are you doing for others?" But a person maybe a little bit less well known is this guy here. Anybody recognize him? That's Abraham Heschel, who was a famous Jewish theologian. Had another quote that I like to sort of end with. He said, "Every little deed counts, every word matters, and all of us, everyone, has the power to redeem the world." I think to create this economy of integrity, it will take every one of us, and it will take all of you, whether you choose to intrapreneur or entrepreneur, to build the ethical brands that will form the architecture of this new economy. So, I write for Huffington Post and Motley Fool. You can find me on Twitter at Jonathan G. And you can check out some of the websites that I mentioned today. Thank you very much.